I will surrender my position as empress. Chapter 8. Don't worry, you are my lover. From AudiNovel. Duke Despon's frown deepened as he watched Diane make her way through the sea of nobility. The nobles' gazes followed her every move, some murmuring behind their fans, their whispers like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Look at how favored she is by His Majesty, one noblewoman said, a hint of envy in her voice. But it's like a sandcastle, isn't it? Beauty and love are fleeting, another chimed in. I wonder how the Empress will react to this, a man said, his voice tinged with curiosity. She must be furious that her concubine took off on the first night, a woman replied, her tone filled with speculation. But what can you say about Her Majesty? She's a little terrifying, isn't she? Another asked, fear creeping into her voice. Well, Diane Poitiers is certainly a more beautiful woman, a man said, and the nobles chuckled amongst themselves. Adele watched the scene unfold with a hint of amusement on her face as Diane approached her. The nobles' eyes shone with interest as the two women faced each other across the grand staircase. The musicians too had lowered the bows, their attention fixed on the two women. Diane bowed her head and bent her knees in a formal gesture. Greetings, Her Majesty the Empress. My name is Diane Poitiers. Diane introduced herself with a respectful bow, her head lowered in deference. Adele smiled sweetly, her beauty like a field of lilies in bloom as she raised her head slightly. Everyone's eyes were on the two women, watching their interaction closely. The Empress responded solemnly, her expression carefully composed. It's a pleasure to meet you, Lady Poitiers, she said. I'm the one who prepared the wedding ceremony and this banquet. How is it, do you like it? Diane's question was bold, but she couldn't help but want to know how the Empress felt about having the Emperor's mistress at the banquet. The Empress was met with menacing, glittering gazes from the nobles, but she didn't respond. She simply stared at Diane blankly, her face expressionless. The silence in the dining hall was palpable, and everyone could hear the sound of their own eyelashes as they blinked. After a moment, the Empress softly lifted her lips and smiled, as if she had never done so before. All this time, you've worked hard, Lady Poitiers. Don't be upset that I didn't wear the banquet gown you had prepared. Thought it's beautiful. I couldn't wear it even if I wanted to because it was too small in size, so I just couldn't put it on. Please don't apologize for it, everyone makes mistakes. Only then did the ladies realize that the Empress was dressed in a wedding gown and they exchanged glances among themselves, murmuring in confusion. Now that I look at it, she is wearing her wedding dress. I didn't notice it since it doesn't stand out, said a lady in the crowd. Wait. The dress prepared by Lady Poitiers was small. Don't tell me she intentionally, said another voice in the crowd. It was produced according to Kotrov's proportions. Apparently, the size standards were different. We apologize for the inconvenience, Diane said, her voice tinged with confusion and frustration, after biting her molars hard in response to the nobles' murmurs. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the entrance of the hall. His Majesty has arrived. The nobles quickly turned around at the sound of an attendant's voice echoing through the hall, where even the music had stopped. The Emperor, who had not shown his face until now, stood there with a stern expression, his presence commanding the attention of all in the room. The nobles stepped back to make way for him as Karl walked towards the throne. The Empress was seated on the throne. Her demeanor was calm and collected, giving off the impression that she naturally held power and control, and would not be swayed by the slightest disturbance. Meanwhile, Diane's entire body relaxed as she saw Karl. He was her only hope, her only source of light. Tears formed in her eyes unintentionally. The emperor frowned as he stopped in front of her, and her gentle eyes filled with tears. He then looked back and forth between the empress and Diane, his expression unreadable, but Adele knew what he was thinking. "Are you crying?" The emperor's voice was low and deep, a hint of concern in his tone as he blocked Diane's path, shielding her from the empress's gaze. Hidden in the crowd, Lennox smiled, a small smirk playing on his lips as he watched the scene unfold. The aristocrats' eyes widened, their expressions filled with intrigue as they looked on. Adele, too, couldn't help but let out a small grin, her lips curving upward as she watched the exchange between Karl and Diane. "Your Majesty," a thin voice came from behind him. "I'm truly astounded. This is a new experience for me. Should I start crying too?" Adele felt a surge of anger and irritation. From the start of their marriage, the emperor seemed determined to belittle her importance, and the only person who annoyed her more than Diane Poitiers was the emperor himself. "What are you doing?" the emperor asked, his tone sharp. "That's what I'd like to know," Adele replied, trying to compose herself. "We were exchanging greetings. What kind of greeting would make one cry like this?" Karl asked, frowning at Diane's tears. "I myself am curious as to why she's crying as well." She approached me and smiled. "Ask the young lady if you're curious about why she wanted to say hi," Adele replied, her voice becoming sharper. Karl turned to face Diane after hearing Adele's comments. Her face was marred by tears and fear. "I just wanted to greet Her Majesty the Empress," Diane said, trying to explain her actions, her voice trembling. The emperor focused his gaze on Diane's face for a brief moment, which seemed to last an eternity to Adele, who was watching them. He then turned his gaze to the empress. Adele felt like she could strangle the man with her eyes. The two locked eyes in a heated exchange as the nobility watched on. The emperor slowly approached Adele, his gaze fixed on her like a predator stalking its prey and his steps heavy and deliberate. Adele raised her head to meet his gaze, unwavering. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, before turning and taking his seat on the throne. The orchestra began to play, filling the hall with the sounds of music and causing the nobles to stir. The emperor reclined on his throne, accepting a glass of champagne from an attendant. He spoke to the empress, his words cutting through the noise of the feast. "Don't be interested in her," he said, his gaze fixed on Diane, who was sadly watching from a corner of the hall. "I'm saying that this woman is my lover, so don't poke your nose around her. Remember that. Then, I myself won't poke my nose around your lover. Do you understand?" The empress responded with a cold expression. Then Adele smirked, finding a twisted sense of pleasure in the situation. She would often laugh when she was feeling upset. Those words, "Would you please pass along those words to His Majesty's lover?" she asked. "I have only met her twice, but both times she was the one who approached me." As the emperor turned away without a word, Adele couldn't help but feel a sense of victory wash over her. She smiled brightly at the nobles, relishing in their attention and the emperor's discomfort. As she chuckled, a small stir ran through the nobility. "She seems to be keeping her cool," one whispered. Lionel nodded slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. It seemed that rather than maintaining her composure, the empress was trying hard not to lose. He couldn't help but notice that the smile on the empress's face seemed forced, of someone in power, rather than the carefree smile on her lips when she rode a horse. Adele stormed into her palace, dismissing all of her attendants and angrily tearing off her dress. She took deep breaths, trying to calm the anger and frustration that filled her chest, but it was no use. Her eyes shone with determination and her hands clenched tightly in response to the tingling in her peripheral nerves. The Empress's black hair seemed to dance in the air as the room was filled with a shifting of air currents, causing the candles to flicker and the windows to shake. Diane Poitiers, she muttered to herself. Well, I get why Diana Poitiers behaved that way. She poured herself a glass of golden liquor and downed it in one swift gulp, feeling the burn in her throat as the alcohol hit her bloodstream. Her thoughts were consumed by Karl Ulrich, the man who she saw as repulsive and inexplicable. However, what's the deal with Karl Ulrich? If he loves her so much that he can't live without her, he should have just proclaimed her as the Empress. Why did he act like that after dragging innocent people into this? Do they think this is some kind of tragic romance or a fantasy? Is there a fantasy about an emperor riding a white horse and saving a damsel in distress? Adele muttered to herself angrily. She wished she had someone to confide in and vent her rage to. Despite feeling dizzy and disoriented after drinking 3 glasses of the strong-tasting Echmont moonshine, Adele managed to remove her crown and shoes before getting into bed. The ceiling above her seemed to spin and swirl as she lay there, her thoughts a jumbled mess. Also, what? He'll acknowledge my lover too. Adele's expression contorted into a sincere grimace as she thought about love and its complexities. She recalled her father's words, "You should always act like you have it all. Don't act humble even when you have nothing at all. When you really have nothing, people never fail to find out." Adele had always disregarded these words because she had so much, but now they seemed to take on a new significance. Pretend you've always done it. Even if you lose everything you have in your hands, be vigilant and keep your eyes open. Drop your shoulders and dress casually. When all you have is gone, don't be modest. People will notice it as if it was a ghost. Adele repeated her father's words, her eyes filling with determination and anger. She knew that she would have to be vigilant and keep her eyes open if she wanted to survive in the cutthroat world of politics and power. An empress not acknowledged by the emperor has nothing but her title. The moment this fact is brought to light, everyone will rush to rip me apart, right? Adele had originally intended to take a more measured approach to her new role as empress, but now she knew that she needed to take action. She queried her ladies-in-waiting about the inner workings of the palace and asked them, who's the one responsible for the general management of the palace? Currently the position is vacant, said a maid. Vacant. Then who's filling it temporarily? Is young Lady Diana Poitiers the one who's filling it temporarily? It was not a surprise to learn that Diane Poitiers, the emperor's favorite, was currently serving as the acting manager. Then who was the previous general manager? Adele asked. It was Countess Hannah Giggs, came the swift response. Adele knew that she needed to work quickly if she wanted to assert her control over the palace. She instructed her ladies-in-waiting to call Countess Giggs and request a meeting with her. The servants looked at her with apprehension, knowing that Diane Poitiers was responsible for dismissing Hannah Giggs from her position. But Adele was not deterred, her determination and urgency clear in her tone. "Bring me the newest editions of the Imperial Palace Law Book up to date," she ordered. As Adele sat at her desk, studying the chronicles of the Imperial Palace, a name caught her eye. It appeared repeatedly throughout the pages, each entry detailing a new law or amendment that had been implemented under this person's guidance. Who the hell is this person who caused such a stir in the palace? She muttered to herself as she read on, intrigued by the impact this individual had made in the court politics. The ragged law, governed the management of the Echmont imperial palace and was the result of a tumultuous relationship between the emperor and empress, arguing over the authority to run the palace. The law stated that the empress had the authority to assign personnel, but needed the emperor's approval to discharge employment. It also stated that the empress had the right to allow residence in the imperial palace, but even went as far as to specify that the emperor had the right to choose the wallpaper for the palace where he resided. Legend had it that the former empress became enraged when reading the accompanying brochure, exclaiming, "A fight is merely about that. What kind of nuisance is this?" Because of this, subsequent emperors entrusted the internal decision-making authority of the palace to the empress, effectively transferring most of their own authority to her. It means that the powers of the current emperor have been given to Diane Poitiers, not to me, Adele said with a click of her tongue, flipping back to the page she had been reading. But at least the empress's inherent rights are bestowed concurrently with her appointment. Adele knew that being the empress came with a heavy burden of responsibilities, and it was nearly impossible to handle everything alone. She had heard that previous empresses had made palace management more efficient by appointing their own aides as general managers of the palace. With that in mind, Adele had contacted Hannah Giggs, the former empress's appointed general manager of the imperial palace. As she waited for Mrs. Hannah Giggs to arrive, Adele's maid eventually unlocked the door and entered the room, announcing a surprise visitor. Adele had expected it to be Mrs. Hannah Giggs, but was surprised to see someone else. Hi. Want more? AudiNovel.